Remember as a kid how you made your own movies by drawing little figures on the pages of a pad and flipping the pages to make the figures move? That's the basic principle behind animated pictures today.
Now, I'll be your host and guide as we journey together along the rambunctious road to comic book artistry. Let's start drawing.
Okay, our guest today is a veteran in the comic industry for about 35 years. He's a master inker, and he's a friend. I met him a few years ago. We hung out. It's ART THIBERT. Welcome.
Hey Ryan, thanks for having me.
So we'll just start off, with basic stuff like, where'd you grow up and everything, and like when did you start drawing and everything?
So you want my backstory?
Yeah, your origin story.
My origin story. Yeah, so I'm a native Californian. I do travel though, so I'm not, just here. I've seen other places. Mm-hmm. And so I grew up just like most people that draw comics. I've drawn them since I was a little kid. The Batman '66 TV show with Adam West lit a fire, and it's never burned out. So I never looked back. So I think it was about 5 years old when that show came out. So the comic bug and cartoons and drawing hit me at about 5 years old.
Yeah, that was one of my favorites too. I like when Batgirl was always on. It was always a cool surprise.
Yeah, she had a cool motorcycle.
Yeah. Who were your early influences?
I think my main influence was probably Neil Adams in the day, and then there was George Perez, and I liked Ross Andrew, and most of the guys from about that time I liked. But I think Neil Adams and Dick Giordano were my biggest influences when I was young.
So how did you get into the biz? Like, did you go to school for art or anything, or?
I always drew. I never knew that it could be clean and get paid for it. And when I graduated high school, I went to local JCs and things like that. But I was mostly studying like theater and theater design, like sets, things like that. And I took a life drawing class, and it ignited the fire. So I liked drawing, and so I just kept drawing within, the JC structure when I could, because I was working full time and I was in a rock band, so I didn't have a lot of time for school. But then I started getting better at it and started seeing that there was a potential to actually make money at it. So then the priorities shifted, and I started drawing more, playing music less. I still had to work because I was out on my own pretty early on. So I think I was around 18, 19 when I was out. So I had to make a living, had to pay my rent. So I started working mainly after I always took classes. I could never stay in school, have the luxury of time, and I never had money. So I would usually take a night class, like take a life drawing class or an illustration class, or things like that. And I moved around quite a bit. I lived in Whittier at first, and then I moved to Huntington Beach, and then to Manhattan Beach. So I think like the first 5 years or so, even working professionally in the comics industry, I still took classes. So like I said, I could never like take a 4-year school, but I periodically, and like I said, even when I was working professionally, I was still in school, taking classes and things like that. So
what was
that's what I did.
What was the thing that sort of made you think like you could get in stuff? Like for me and for a lot of people, it was like Jim Lee. See, it's like, and that was like a big time where like a lot of artists, wanted to get in, but at that time, what like maybe books or creators made you like want to get in, and how did you even like get in? Did you submit to the companies, or did you go to conventions or something?
when I was younger, I sent letters to Marvel and like, hey, I'm an aspiring artist or whatever, and got my rejection letters back like everybody else. But I pretty much gave up on the drawing stuff when I got into my teen years. And the only reason I kept drawing is because as a band, a drummer in a band, you always needed flyers and you needed artwork and logos and things like that. So that's what I mainly did then. But like I said, when I started going to school, I was working as an illustrator in LA. So I did like novel covers, novel interiors. I worked for Bridge Publication. Bridge Publication is Dianetics, and they printed a lot of different sci-fi, like Battlefield Earth, things like that. They had Frank Frazetta that did some covers and things for them. So I was in good company. So I did some covers. So I did like paintings and full illustrations. So I was mainly an illustrator. I wanted to do like, novel covers, album covers, things like that. So that was kind of my like Drew Struzan type of stuff. And that's what I wanted to do. And so I was taking an illustration course at Golden West in Whittier College. And the teacher there saw that I liked comics, because I guess the style, once it's in your blood, you can't get it out. It's always there. So even when I would draw like realistic stuff, they were always heightened, kind of like comic book stuff. And so he said, "You seem like you have this comic book like thing going here." And I said, "Yeah, I like comic books a lot." And he said, "I know a comic book artist," and it was a guy named Brian Murray. And so Brian Murray was one of the early Image guys. He did a lot of color work for Extreme Studios, and I think he was the first artist on Supreme, the Extreme book. And so he got me hooked up with that guy, and he was working for Neil Adams' continuity. I think it was that Megalith or whatever that character's name was, the big, like muscular guy, the strong guy. And so he was doing that. And so I would help him out in the studio. Like, I don't know, a lot of people don't know this, but sometimes when you get like an artist gets in a deadline bind, or you hang out with other people, with the other artists in their studio, you end up like helping them out on their book. You know what I mean? You end up drawing stuff, backgrounds and things like that. So I'd help him out, and I would do whatever I could, just to hang out and listen to him and try to pick his brain and find out, how you do these things and who to talk to and all that stuff. And so he was a little bit of a mentor, but he knew Jim Valentino. And Jim Valentino was working for Renegade Press at the time. He was doing Normal Man. It was a highly acclaimed indie book. And I think Renegade was connected to Aardvark Vanheim, which was the Cerebus company. And so I started helping out Jim. And so Jim got a job from Apple Comics. I think they were called Apple, which was the Wendy and Richard Pinney, the ElfQuest people. So he started working for them and needed an inker. So I just needed to make a living. So I was still doing my illustration and going to school. And I was still working pretty much full time, even my first couple of years in the comics industry, because I was just never sure if it was going to pan out or not. So I always kind of hedged my bets. So I was working full time, going to school, at night. I only took like 2 classes a week, because that's all I could kind of, that's the only time I had. By then the band thing was gone. And so I just started inking for Valentino, and it started paying my rent. So it ended up paying me more than my illustration stuff. And it was a pain in the butt to drive to LA and try to, talk to art directors, get work, things like that. It was quite a struggle. So there's a lot of hustle involved with doing it. And I didn't have a reputation then. And like I said, it started paying my rent. So when you're out on your own, whatever takes care of your needs financially is usually where you end up going. So I didn't consciously pursue comic books. It just kind of fell in place.
Mm-hmm.
I always had a love for it, but it just fell into place. And so just like all independent ventures, or most independent ventures, especially at the time, we would get our upfront money against royalties, but then our back end money, after sales and stuff, stopped coming in. Yeah, shame on you, Wendy and Richard Pinney, because it was hard to make ends meet, and then the second payment wasn't coming in, and so I had to start figuring things out. And I liked comic books, so I put a portfolio together, like a Marvel DC portfolio, because I didn't really have superhero stuff in my portfolio. And so I started putting things together and would go to shows, and I would show off stuff to different editors and people there at the show and get input.
You're focused more on like the penciling, or did the inking kind of? I didn't
even know there was a difference. Like I just penciled and inked and colored my own stuff. Like I just did everything. So I was writing my own books. I was drawing. I was inking. I was doing everything. So so then I met Jim Shooter, and then Jim Shooter liked what I was doing, but he said, "You're not quite there yet." And he said, "Come to New York City. We have a Marvel bullpen, and I would love for you to come down, and you can get your chops there. You can work." I believe it was Johnny Romita Sr. At the time that was running the bullpen. Wow. And so I was like, hell yeah. I was I was like ecstatic about it. I was so excited. And so then I worked to try to get enough money to fly to New York City. I got the money. I flew to New York City. I met a guy prior. His name was Craig Anderson. There's always Craig Andersons in all of our stories. There's like this guy that you know that can get you introduced to these other people.
Right, yeah.
So Craig I'd met through Jim Valentino earlier on, and Craig said, you say these things and sometimes you mean them, sometimes you don't. He said, "If there's anything I can do for you, Art, just let me know." So I do believe I gave him a phone call prior, but I just showed up on his doorstep. I flew to New York City. He lived in New York City in Hell's Kitchen on 42nd Street. I still remember it. I flew to New York. I came to his door. He was at work, so I just kind of sat there until he got home from work. He comes, home. I'm like, "Hey, Craig, Art." And he's like, "What the hell?" So I told him, he said, "Oh, okay." He must have just felt really bad for me, because I think I was very, very naive at the time. I was probably around 19, 20 years old. And so
he let me in. Kind of in college, or you were out of college, or you didn't?
I never really was officially in college. I just took classes. Yeah. So like I said, my first 5 years, even working professionally in the comics industry, I still took classes. So I popped in and out of school all that time, because I could never really sit down and take 4 years, at a time and learn.
Yeah.
I just didn't have the luxury of that kind of time.
Yeah.
So anyway, so then I just, I went to Marvel, and I showed my portfolio around, and I got rejected by everybody. And I mentioned to Jim Shooter, I tried to get in to talk to Jim Shooter to talk to him about the bullpen thing. He said he didn't remember it. He didn't remember the bullpen conversation. So I was crushed. As a bone, Jim Shooter's, she was so sweet. His secretary came out. She goes, there is a job for you here. And I said, "Oh, great. What is it?" And she said, "As an intern." And I go, "What does an intern do?" And so she told me, "You pass out the mail and you do X, Y, Z." I go, "I can do that." And I said, "How much does it pay?" And she goes, No, internship doesn't pay anything. And I go, "Well, how am I going to live in New York? How am I going to stay here if I can't make any money?" I was just a stupid kid. And so she's just like, "Well, I don't know. This is what's on the table." So I must have looked pretty crushed. And so I had a friend here in California. I think he lives in Northern California. His name was Art Nichols. And I had fallen out of communications with him. And he just happened to be at the Marvel offices at that moment. Like I said, there's always this third person. Like there's always this guy that connects you with other people,
He already got in, or he was trying to get in, or?
He was already in. Yeah, he was
Oh.
established, and yeah, I hadn't heard anything about that. We had no internet back then, so there was no way to really stay in communication with anybody. And so he said, I'm taking a cab over to DC Comics. You want to join me? And so I had nothing else to do. So I was like, sure. And so we went to DC. I went in, I talked to a couple editors. Bob Greenberger was the main guy I talked to.
Mm-hmm.
I showed him my portfolio, and the first thing out of his mouth, and I swear he said this, he said, "What do you want to do here?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He goes, "What do you want to draw?" And I said, "Are you serious?" And he goes, "Yeah." And I said, "Anything," I was just a stupid kid. I said, "Anything you have." And so that day, I got pencil and ED Comics. Wow. And then, so later that evening, the thing about Craig Anderson, which I didn't say, he was assistant editor to Ralph Macchio at Marvel. Mm-hmm. So then he comes in, because that's where I was staying, mm-hmm. and he said that there's ink work here at Marvel if you want. This kiddie line of books called Starline. They did like Heathcliff and I don't know, Matt, for like comic book stuff they had. So I ended up getting work there. So the worst day of my life turned into the best day of my life. Wow, so cool. I could not have been any more crushed today, and I could not have been any higher, by the end of the day. So you guys know, so I got pencil and ink work at DC. Wow. And ink work at Marvel on the same day. So it was a pretty good day all in all.
Okay, I have some comics that I found.
Some what?
Some comics. Can you see them? Oh.
Yes. Legion.
I know there's some other books, but I remember seeing this and then seeing your name in there.
Was that?
I think you did.
Barry?
Maybe it was this one.
Barry Sonnenfeld. Very delicious. Oh my gosh! I think that may be some of my first work. Where'd you find that? Oh, it's the Legion Who's Who. Okay.
I know I had another DC like Who's Who, and I saw your signature. I remember when I was young, I saw that your signature. So what was your first work then?
My first official comic?
Yeah.
Was Pencils on the Warlord for DC Comics.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I think I followed Dan Jurgens on that, and I think the Kubert brothers followed me on that book before it got canceled.
Oh, wow. And then what did you
do? I think
for
it was the
Marvel?
book DC tried new talent.
What did you do
for
Marvel?
I don't know the name of those two guys, like Dan Jurgens and Adam and Andy Kubert. They just disappeared after that right? No, they did not.
No, they didn't. What did you do for Marvel?
I worked on the Inhumanoids. It was the Kitty Line book.
Oh, right, yeah.
So
like the toy line.
Over Jose Delbo. Yeah, that's a blast from the past.
Cool. I have this one too. Oh, this is later, right?
Oh yeah, that's much later. That's probably 10 years. That's about 10 years into my career inking Art Adams.
What did you work on in between there? Did you do more pencil work, or when did you start like inking?
I did both. I never did one over the other. I did them both at the same time. So at Marvel I was inking, and at DC I was penciling.
Oh, nice.
It's pretty weird, right?
That's a good one.
So DC was throwing better work at me at the time, so I stayed there, and I got a job doing an 8-issue miniseries called Kind Masters, which is also where they got the title for the TV show. So the TV show is loosely based on that run, and I penciled. I wanted to ink the series, but there just wasn't enough time. So that was 8 issues, and that was the time when DC was doing a lot of prestige, like miniseries, like Watchmen and stuff like that. So it was kind of in line of, it was kind of a more adult take, on Rip Hunter and Cave Carlson and all the different like adventure characters that DC had at the time. And it had cameos by Booster Gold and the Justice League and different characters. So that was a pretty cool run. And while I was doing that, believe it or not, I got the call to do finishes over Dan Jurgens on Adventures of Superman. So DC knew that I was a pretty strong penciler, inker, and so Dan just needed somebody to, because Dan does great breakdowns and good storytelling. He's not a great finisher, and if you ask him, he'll say he doesn't even want to be, because he wants to be able to work with a lot of different people that will help define his style. So every project he works on, if he works with a different inker that has a define or like a definite style, then it'll help define that run of whatever title he's working on. So I was working on Adventures of Superman at the same time I was finishing up my pencil on Time Masters, and at this point I don't think I was working at Marvel at all. And so then I got a call while I was working on Adventures of Superman to come over and help out on an X-Men annual that Art Adams was working on. And
which one?
Did it have Dark Phoenix when she had the studded red like bodysuit and the studs? I think it was around that time.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. That was, I think, 13.
Yeah, I'm not that good at it. All blurs together. I've done so much work, so
yeah, I remember those.
Yeah, it was a good time, and then I started getting a pretty good friendship with Walter Simonson. I love Walter Simonson. He'll deny it, but he was kind of a mentor of mine, and he will deny it if you ask him. And so he doesn't let a lot of people ink him, and he was doing his run on Fantastic Four, and he got into a deadline kind of crunch, and so he gave up the inking chores to me, and so I inked him on an issue. I think maybe I helped him out on a couple pages before that, but then my official, I did an official issue with him after that, and it was a blast. I remember just everybody was like, because I didn't know anything. I didn't know how people worked. I didn't know reputations, and so people would say to me, "He's like, you inked Walter Simonson?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "No one inks Walter Simonson. Walter inks all of his own stuff." He said, "That's quite a privilege." And I said, "It was fun. I just remember having a lot of fun." I didn't know anything about that. So looking back, also Walter doesn't sell any of his original artwork, so he keeps a pretty tight rein on all of his stuff. And like I said, we became pretty good friends, and I remember talking to him, and he was trying to come up with an idea for the Fantastic Four annual, I think. And so he just asked me, like, well, what do you think about, the Fantastic Four and stuff like that? And this was the time when Sharon, what was her name? She was the female Thing. And so at that time, there was the female Thing, and then Ben Grimm was Ben Grimm again. And so they kind of had this love thing, but they could never kind of connect, because either he was a rock monster or she was a human, and vice versa. So I said I would do this. I would do, and this story hadn't been done prior. I said I would have her, because I'd have that their love was undeniable in the story. I would have her want to be human again so she could be with him, and then he wants to be the rock monster again so he could be with her. And so unbeknownst to each other, they do this, and they're back to square one. And I said the reason I wanted to see that happen is because I liked Ben Grimm as the Thing better than Sharon, whatever her name was, as the Thing. And it was weird. She had breasts and stuff. It was kind of odd. And not that I have a problem with girl power, because I'm all about girl power. But I don't know. At the time, I thought it was weird. And so he goes, "That's a great idea." And I was like, "Really?" It's like, "That's what I'll do." And so that's what he did. The annual was based on the story idea that it was just a part of the story, but that's what he did. And so he wrote in the credits, he said, "Special thanks to ART THIBERT." He said, "Thanks and nothing more," or something like that, meaning I didn't get paid for the idea.
That's all you get.
So I still think of that as like a high point. So I think that's also what sparked my confidence that maybe I could write, because we get to brainstorm on things. And so when Walter Simonson takes credit, he thinks what you came up with was a good idea, then it gives you a little bit of confidence. So
Let's fast forward a little bit. I can't find my Jim Lee X-Men. I don't even have to find them, but I know you inked Jim Lee over or X-Men, and then over Will Spartacio, right?
Yeah. So it was about that same time. So I was still doing finishes on. God, I did 3 books a month for maybe 4 or 5 months. So get this. I was doing finishes on Dan Jurgens on Adventures of Superman. I was working with either Art Adams, Walter Simonson,
Wow.
or Jim Lee.
Wow.
And so I think I was doing, this is what it was. I was working with Walter, Jim, and Dan Jurgens at the same time.
Wow.
On X-Men, Fantastic Four, and Superman. So those were big titles too.
Yeah, that's huge.
If I wasn't so stupid at the time, I think I would have been a nervous wreck, but I had no idea what anything was or what I was doing. So yeah, so then I think I was working with Jim on Uncanny X-Men. So I was I was like the alternate inker. Scott Williams, so we were both doing stuff like that. And at that time, Hack Shack Studios was full on a functional ink studio. So I had like 2 assistants that you might have heard of. There was Scott, Trevor Scott.
Oh, Trevor.
And,
wow.
Yeah, and then there was I don't know. You might have heard of him, Danny Mickey.
Oh yeah.
So
Okay.
he and Trevor Scott were my assistants at the time, and so we were doing a lot of backgrounds and stuff for Jim Lee and Scott at the time too. So we were helping out. It was just kind of like I said earlier on. At the time, you just helped out. Like you just did whatever it took to get the books done, and we weren't even. There was no money in it at the time. So we didn't even care, we were just doing comics and having fun. And as long as my rent was made, I was happy. So that's how we did it at the time. So then the X-Men thing started happening more and more. And so I started becoming more friends with, at the time they were Homage Studios. So I had Hack Shack Studios because we had a fax machine. So I remember I just started, we had to have some kind of like letterhead. So I came up with this Hack Shack Studios logo and I sent it out. And I remember Jim Lee calling me. He's like, "Art, it's like, you can't do this." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" He goes, "You know what a hack is, right?" I go, "Yeah, I know what a hack is." He goes, "Well, that's a derogatory term for a guy that does bad work." I go, "Yeah, it's funny. It's hack
Like, I know.
quality work, but we're hacks. We're just saying we're hacks." And he goes, he just shakes his, he's like, "I don't know, Art." So the next thing I know, Jim's got the pretentious Homage Studios. Like I'm getting those letterheads back. So I think that's where the whole studio thing started coming from.
Is the logo the same as your hat, or is that a newer one? Newer
logo? One of the newer ones. So this actually was created by Alan Martinez, who was also an assistant of mine, and then he went over to help out Danny Mickey on in Crime and stuff like that. Yeah. So thank you, Ellen, for doing that. We've stuck with it ever since. But yeah, so the Jim Lee stuff and Homage, and I started hanging out with those guys more. I'd even drive, because I lived in the South Bay, in Manhattan Beach, and I think I lived in Hermosa at the time. So we used to kind of commute back and forth. I had a little studio in Redondo Beach. So I remember Will's coming and hanging out, and we'd work together, and I would drive down to San Diego. They had an apartment at the time, so they were renting an apartment. That's kind of how I did it as well. And so the apartment was kind of like you could crash there if you had a deadline, but mainly it had a kitchen, and then they had like the living space, like the dining room, living room area. They had as like a bullpen area. So they had like Jim, Will's, and Scott's desk in there. And I think Chido, Joe came in later, and I think he lived there, and he had he had one of the bedrooms. And I think Carl Alstetter came in too, and I'm not sure if he lived there as well.
Is that the one in Mira Mesa?
I think so, yeah. And so that's kind of how we did it at the time. And so, like I said, it was whatever it took. So however we could get the books done, make our deadline. Like I said, there was no money in it. But then we got wind that the industry was changing. And we started getting royalties and started getting our crazy money. So it was insane. I remember getting taking my girlfriend out to dinner. My girlfriend then is now my wife, Pamela, and I took her out. I showed her the check.
Wow.
It was like 20 grand or something like that in royalties for an issue, for a 22-page story that I inked.
Wow.
And she's like, yeah, I'm going to marry you. No, she didn't say that.
This is still in Marvel, though. This is like at the height of Marvel, right?
This was the start. This was the start when things started picking up. So the royalties were coming in, and so that was the start of the boom, when the boom was starting to hit. And so at the time, I'm still working with Dan Jurgens on Adventures of Superman, doing finishes. And I really, really liked that. I liked everybody I was working with. I absolutely love Mike Carlin. I think him and Bob Harris are the best editors I've ever worked with. And so it pained me to have to leave, but I said, I have to leave that part of it, like inking Dan Jurgens and doing finishes. So he said, I want to keep you here, and we have some big plans here at with the Superman books. And he said, I want to keep you here. What can I do? And I said, I don't know. You know, he said, what if I gave you cover work? So he officially gave me covers for Action. No, it was Adventures. No. Yeah, it was Action Comics. It was Action Comics that I was doing pencils and inks for. So I did almost a year's run, or about a year's run, doing covers for Superman, for Action Comics. And it went all the way up to the death of. So the Doomsday Reveal covers, I did a couple of those. I wish I still had those as well. But at the time, I was more committing to Marvel and the X books with Jim Lee. And I think the Will stuff started picking up at that time too. So I started inking Will's, at the time. So it just started my, not loyalty, but it just kind of started kind of doing more stuff with Jim and Will's at that time, and less stuff for DC. And I remember that when I had to tell Mike Carlin that I was going to leave, he was like, okay. And because no one knew that Doomsday stuff was going to be like the biggest selling book of all time. So I left there and started working, full-time at Marvel. And I remember having a conversation later with Dan Jurgens, and Dan was like, don't you feel stupid for leaving, DC, because we did the death of and all that? And I said, no, because stuff that we did, that Jim, Will, and Scott and myself did, was way more important, I think, in the big scheme of comics, because it really did influence the next 10 years, I think, of comic evolution.
Yeah. It totally influenced me.
What's that?
It totally influenced me too. Like,
Oh, yeah. I mean, they called it the West Coast style. And so there were really only four of us that were working in that style at the time. And so I look at it as a great badge of honor. And I do believe that we were all throwing our influences and different things into the mix at the time. So it was a lot of fun. And I think the skies were the limit. And we were just pushing style and comics just as far as we could take them, stylistically. And if you look at the evolution, those comics were changing sometimes month to month. Like our influences were definitely there on our sleeve, month to month. We'd go from Art Adams heavy influence to like a Barry Windsor Smith, to Klaus Janson, influence. So
Yeah.
a good time. Yeah, I don't look back and go, oh well, I didn't get to work on the best-selling book of all time, but we did have a pretty good run on those X books.
Yeah, X-Men is huge though too. Okay, so let's transition now from Marvel to Image. How did that all go down?
It was a crazy fun time. I don't think anybody had a clear vision of what was going to happen or where it was going to go. We just knew that we were getting 1% of like 1% in royalties, and that Marvel was making quite a bit of money. And so we were asking, we at this point, there's like Todd McFarlane, there's Rob Liefeld, there's Silvestri, there's Jim Lee, and all the Homage guys. And so there was not a power struggle, but there was a little bit more of a conversation about maybe more fair or equal compensation for what we did. And so Marvel's argument was that it's the characters, not the creators. And so I think that stemmed most of the I guess the fuel for the fire to create Image Comics, because there was obviously something wrong with Marvel's philosophy, because they hadn't sold anything. They hadn't sold those numbers prior to us working on those books. So there was a correlation that they weren't really admitting or admitting at the time. So I think that's kind of what stemmed a lot of it, to kind of do our own thing. And so Marvel tried. The wind was in, I guess, the whatever was in the wind, the scent or whatever. And so Marvel tried to keep me there by offering me cable, pencil and ink cable. And I worked with Fabian Nicieza on that book. And but the thing is, I was already at Image even when I was working on those. I wasn't officially there, but I was already there. I had an office at Extreme Studios and everything. But back up a bit, I do remember having a lot of meetings with Jim Lee and Mark Silvestri, because I lived in the South Bay. So at that time, I had a condo in Redondo Beach, and Silvestri lived in Malibu. So we were more neighbors at the time, and I really loved that area. So we would hang out socially, him and his girlfriend and me and mine. And he would talk about the Cyberforce book that he wanted to do. So he wanted me to ink that. And so that was on the table. And then I wasn't going to ink Wildcats, but Jim and Wills offered me, what was it, Wetworks at the time.
Oh, yeah.
So while I was finishing up my cable run, I had those two things on the table, and I was fast enough, and then with studio help, because I still had Danny Mickey and Trevor Scott, even though Trevor was doing work, I think, at DC at the time, like on his own. He was still working out of the studio and helping out when he could. So I could have done both of those books, and especially when you look back, I think there was only one issue of Cyberforce that came out that year, maybe two, and Wetworks didn't even come out that year. So Wills had personal problems and issues.
So you joined Extreme Studios, Rob Liefeld's studio, and then you created your own book too, right? black and white?
Yeah, so I think it was towards the end of the first year of Image. So I was working out of the Extreme offices. He had a big office building. Image was there too. It was the Disney Casting Building off of Catella in Anaheim. And so I had my own office on the 15th floor. I overlooked Anaheim Stadium. It was pretty cool. It was a pretty big time. There's a lot of money being made at the time. So I was doing covers and different things for Rob, and so we would talk. And he said, "Well, I think it's time that you did, your own book. You want to." So he said, "Do you have any ideas?" So I had pitched to him this idea called Black and White, and he's like, "Black and White, I like it." He goes, "Just like the Jackson song." And I go, "Yeah, it's the Jackson song." So he greenlit it, and I had a special deal, so I had an even better deal than the Image deal. So through Rob, I had like an inside deal with Image, so I got a better percentage and everything than if like an outsider came in and published their book. So it was really cool. Rob was very generous. I'm very thankful to him and all the Image guys for supporting me the way they did. And so, yeah, a couple months later, we had Black and White. The initial run was 3 issues in 1994, so 25 years ago. And so we had done that. We had 3 issues, and it was a smash hit. I think we debuted in the top 15 of the top 100 books. We sold, I think the miniseries sold like 700,000 copies between all 3 issues. So this is practically unheard of now. And I paid for this house. It was really good times financially. And those guys knew how to market themselves. Like I think a lot of people should go back and look and see how Image and the individual people marketed themselves, because it was kind of like Stan Lee, early Marvel, where everybody was like, comics are cool, this is the place to be, stuff like that. There wasn't a lot of doom and gloom. There wasn't a lot of sadness. There was only like, we're going to take over the world kind of thing. And it not only helped all the creative people, charge their, I guess, move them forward. But it also worked as far as like getting fans and readers in. It got them excited. It got the retailers excited because they were making money. So I always say, like, no matter how bad things seem, even if you're publishing an indie book and it's not maybe doing that well, never ever let them see you sweat. Never let on that you're not having the time of your life. Right. That this is exactly where you want to be. This is a dream come true. You're getting this book into people's hands. People are excited about it. They're excited. Retailers are excited. Because it's fundamental. If you start talking about like doom and gloom and how bad the industry and stuff like that is, then it almost becomes wish fulfillment. So why would you want to hang out with somebody at a party? Like, they're throwing a party, but they're like, this party stinks, when if you have this air that this party is the be all end all, this is where you want to be.
Like, this is right.
Yeah, this is the coolest place to be. Then people are going to want to hang out. People are going to want to be part of it. And so I took that from, I was never like that anyway, but I really held on to that. So, even Ryan's doing a lot more independent properties with your set Shadow Zone, which, by the way, it looks amazing.
Oh, thank you.
The book is great. And Barbara Kiesel, who was Barbara Randall at the time, was one of the early supporters at DC Comics when she was an editor. So if you're listening, Barbara, thank you, and thank you for your help. I think she was editing the Titans at the time, so I was doing some pencils, inks on some Titan books around that time. So, so
what is Black and White all about?
It's basically well, I'm going to let Taylor come in and talk about it. Can we maybe shift over? We can talk about
Okay.
it that way. I don't want to shoehorn stuff, but
Okay. Yeah, that's
is that
fine.
okay?
Yeah.
Actually, I do want to shoehorn stuff. That's exactly what I want to do. So should I kill the camera feed and then just
Okay.
go with icon, or
Yeah. So we'll just go into screen share
introduce?
screen share mode.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll let Taylor see. That's right. That's Ryan Taylor right there.
Hi, Ryan.
Hey, Taylor. So Taylor, how do you say your last name? Grosso?
Grosso, yes.
She's helping out Art with writing black and white.
Oh, she's full on co-writer.
Oh, cool.
Book. So this is pretty much a 50-50 chore. Yeah. So she used to. Well, we still do work in the studio. What, about 5 years ago, Taylor?
Yeah, I would say maybe 6 now.
Yeah. So Taylor came in as an art assistant, and we were It was around the New 52 time, right?
Yes.
Oh, cool.
I think right after your Hawkman run.
Yeah. So we were working with Joe Bennett. And so, what was your first book?
I think it was Detective Comics.
And then it was like it crossed over with Teen Titans, right?
Yeah, I think we were doing them at the same time.
Yeah. So yeah, most of the time at Hack Shack we have multiple projects going at the same time.
Mhm.
So Taylor showed early on that she was not only really good, but she was incredibly fast, and that's really important in this industry.
Mhm.
So she came on primarily as an assistant, but we started brainstorming on just writing and concepts and ideas.
Mhm.
So she showed pretty early on that she had a great story sense,
Mhm.
great character sense, and we just kind of, as we would work on these DC projects, we would just kind of brainstorm on things. And your backstory is like your schooling is story, and like you took screenwriting classes and.
Yeah, I did. Screenwriting. It was more geared towards screenwriting for animation, and storyboarding at the time.
So yeah, you had a good foundation as far as story. So I never had any formal education with that, but Taylor has a footing there.
Oh, cool.
So I just thought I would, just to see what she thought of it, I let her read the black and white miniseries from 1994. And so tell him what you thought of it.
Yeah, I kind of fell in love with the original 90s story,
Mhm.
and I knew, I guess from the time I started working at the studio, that Art had been continuously working on art on black and white and different incarnations. So I'd kind of maybe overheard you talking about different story ideas. And after reading the 90s, when I really kind of fell in love with the original concept, and that book really kind of, for me, defines what is best about 90s comics.
Mhm.
It's really all the best that 90s comics had to offer. In it is a superhero story in a way, but it's actually like a sci-fi spy story. And it really captures the tone of the 90s in the best way. Like, if I was going to introduce people to 90s comics, that's probably the book I would give people.
So I was thinking, Ryan, at the time, because 25 years had passed since the original series. So I was thinking that the times had moved on, and that comics were getting into kind of more cynicism, a little bit more angsty, a little bit more, I don't want to say realistic, but a little bit more, like I'm a musician, so if you think about hair metal and then grunge, that's kind of what also happened in comics, where it went, instead of outward fun, it went internal into angst and personal strife and things like that, almost to the point of just being negative, I thought. And black and white, to begin with, it was kind of railing against it anyway, because the character Black was kind of, he was my my kind of combating more of the gray area heroes, that were kind of ends justify the means. Like they would do bad as long as good was ultimately served. And I just didn't like that hero. I mean, I shouldn't say I didn't like that hero. I was getting tired of that hero. And I thought it would be neat I just said neat, Taylor. I said it would be neat because I'm an old man. I'm a boomer.
It is neat.
It is neat and it's cool. And so one of the things, the character Black was kind of an altruistic character. He did good just to do good. He was like Captain America. He had this. Well, he does have like a checkered past. He does have like all the window dressing of like what would make a negative vigilante, a more darkened character. But it didn't affect him the same way. He still stayed positive. He still stayed kind of altruistic, That's where the black and white, form of justice comes in. So the tagline is, in a world where law and order is often blurred to gray, justice can only be black and white. So it did come out of the frustration of the gray area characters. But the flip side, which I'm going to let Taylor talk about, is Whitney Sung, who kind of more embodies that gray area and ends justify the means.
Yeah, definitely. Whereas Reed is more justice oriented, Whitney is definitely more vengeance oriented, and kind of in that chaotic area of, I guess, picking what she would perceive as justified without taking the law into mind. So she's very much like chaotic energy.
Can we see some images?
Yes. All right.
Your wish is our commitment.
Okay.
So that's the cover for the first issue. The paste up and stuff is more for like advertising, so it's not the actual paste up that will be on the cover. But look at that logo. I just came up with a chicken scratch for the logo, and so Taylor did all the design work for the black and white logo, and it came out pretty amazing.
All right, so this right here is Reed Blackett, aka Black. He's a ex-spy from a British Secret Service, specifically MI10, which is the Anti-Robotics Division. And here he is the vigilante Black working on his own. And this is Whitney Sung, headstrong brewery heiress, now turned into a vengeance-driven vigilante White.
Yes.
Nice.
And we got...
Ooh, who drew that? I don't know.
Why, that's a Greg Capullo Art THIBERT piece.
Nice.
So in '94, Greg was transitioning from the X-Men over to Image. I don't know if you guys know, he did a little run on Spawn.
Yeah.
And I did his first run on Spawn, actually.
So there was an Image meeting one time in the studio at Wildstorm, and Todd was giving out pages for some of the interns to ink, and I was able to ink some like bats on one of the Spawn pages. I think it's like issue 33 or something. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, I think I came in, was it 13, 14, and 15? So it was after the first year of the Spawn run.
Oh.
So this is early Image. So yeah, so Greg and I just really, we just connected, even though he's an East Coaster. But we would try to do shows, where I'd go to the East Coast and he'd come to the West Coast and we'd hang out. So his wife and my wife got along really well, and Greg's a rocker too. So we got to share a lot about musical past. He played in a band, I played in bands, and so I just said I was working on this book, Black and White. And so I just threw out, hey, would you mind doing a cover for me? Actually, it was a pinup at the time, which turned into a cover for the new run. And he said, sure. And he was working on a series called Creech. So he would run story ideas and stuff by me. So I kind of did the same thing with Greg that I did with Walter Simonson prior, where I was just a sounding board and just put my 2 cents in. And so I think he gave me a special thanks in that first run of Creech as well. So he's a good friend, and I'm so glad he did this cover because it's so much kind of part of me now and my life, and this these characters, this concept.
That's cool. So this is like a newly colored image.
Yeah. So what I did is I came in, and part of the black and white idea, the new idea, is it's remastered. So the initial thing was Taylor was like, you have to do this series, Art. You have to do it. And I said, is the tone cool? Is everything still? She goes, yeah, this is going to be a breath of fresh air. And to be honest, she didn't want to change a thing tonally. We just kind of had some ways of clarifying maybe some of the storytelling to make it a little clearer for the audience and things like that. So the initial idea was to remaster the original artwork. So that just trickled down into the Greg Capullo piece. So I still have this piece. So I scanned it and I just started cleaning it up digitally and kind of re-inking it. And not so much bringing it into a contemporary setting, but the scanning, artwork of the time was a little bit more forgiving. The printing was a little bit more forgiving. So the clarity wasn't as good as it is now. So I figured for a current audience in a more modern printing, technology, we would clean it up. So I did that, and then we had our colorist Priya put these wonderful colors over it.
Cool.
And so that's what came out of that. So
tell us about, you're gonna have an IndieGoGo, or is it currently going? It's currently going right now, right?
Yeah. Do you want to show? Can we show that?
Yeah. IndieGoGo is currently active and in demand. We funded pretty early on into the campaign.
We funded in the first day.
Yeah, like early. So we met our goal, and then we decided to keep the book in demand for a time until it went to printing. It's still in demand right now, so that everybody can get a copy. While I guess to get as many books into hands as we can. And you can get both of those covers you saw in a bundle. We have a lot of tiers up for grabs right now.
So the Greg Capullo variant is still available in a tier. And I just want to take a moment to thank everybody. We have over 1,100 backers. That's incredible. And we're over 60K. We're almost 61 at this point. And I think by the time we close this out, we're probably going to be at 70K. So thanks to everybody that bought a book. We're so thankful for all your support. Everybody, people they're posting and reposting, stuff, our updates and everything. So this has been a blast. This is more than we thought was ever possible because, prior we were doing our campaigns through Kickstarter. And so, I think one of our indie books finished at about 17K. And so we were thinking at best, that's what Black and White was going to do. And boy, did it exceed our wildest expectations.
And there's always been like a very large fan presence, even with the 90s series. Like there's Art and Pamela have a giant pile of fan letters from years talking about the series, even after it was done with. And there was fan art, and there was always a fan outcry to bring this series back. So if you were a fan of the 90s Black and White, you're going to like Remastered. It's got the same feel, the same tone, but kind of a new story and a brand new artwork.
A lot of brand new artwork on this. And just to back up for a minute, Taylor, was WonderCon your first big con where you actually had a table and you were hanging out as talent?
It was. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and so you saw firsthand that there still are active Black and White fans.
Yeah, there were people consistently coming up to Art with like the 90s books in pristine condition, wanting them signed and asking about it. The fan base has never diminished for Black and White.
And there were people that had the original series that had said that they bought the new remastered book as well.
Nice. So
yeah, so it was
IndieGo's
very cool.
Indiegogo is a little bit different from Kickstarter, right? But I mean,
It's a lot.
obviously
It's
you
a lot
you reached your
different.
goal, but is it ever end, or is it always
The
open?
If you're asking about the in demand, what happens is, which differs from Kickstarter, and in my opinion, I think it's superior. If you're successful in funding your campaign, you have the option to roll over your campaign into in demand
Mhm.
and turn it into a store.
Oh, nice.
And then you can close it as long as sales are consistent. And we've had consistent sales since our official campaign closed.
Yeah, so I think that the official campaign closed at about 47K,
Mhm.
and so we made over 10. Wait, what was it? 10.
Gosh, over
50, 60.
20.
Yeah, way over 10K,
Wow.
just in the shop, in the store alone.
That's pretty cool.
So yeah, it does, and it rolls over, but you have to tell them you want it to roll over. Otherwise, the campaign will end at the duration that the time that you've given.
You have
or
to
you
do
said
it.
you were.
You have to do it before it ends, or can you do it
Yeah.
after it ends? Oh, before.
It's very convenient though, because then you can offer the book to people who may have missed the campaign before you go to print run. So it really opens it up to an audience that may have missed your book.
Because you know this Ryan, when you did Shadow Zone,
Mhm.
that there are people that didn't know that it was over, that still contact you and say, oh, I didn't know it was over. Can I still get the book? Can we still get the book? So with IndieGoGo in demand, if you roll it over into the shop, you can just say, yeah, it's still available. And they can still pick the book up. And the reason it's cool is because all of the original page still shows up. So all your success, all your backers, all that information is still there. And so if you throw up some good numbers, that's a good selling point for your book. So if you have good numbers and you have a lot of backers, then it's going to entice people to want to buy a book, because they're not going to feel like, oh, well, I'm the only person that is looking into this book. They'll see that there are a lot of other people that came before them that bought the book. So it's kind of like, it's always hard to make that first purchase with a new project, and maybe somebody that you don't know.
Right.
So this way, it actually gives a lot of credibility when you get people to come in, like new people to come in, because they see the numbers, they see the initial campaign, and they see the backers, how many people bought. So they see a certain level of success.
That's awesome.
And the in-demand store is a feature that's available to everybody who funds successfully. Whereas in Kickstarter, it's similar to BackerKit, but BackerKit is not a normal feature of Kickstarter. You have to pay for that separately. IndieGoGo, this is a standard feature.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna have to check that
And
out.
also that IndieGoGo takes less of a percentage, although I did get an email, Taylor, that we have to look it over, that the people that IndieGoGo is partnering with have changed their payment structure. So I assume that means it's gone up. But at this point, it's still less than Kickstarter percentage.
And IndieGoGo is a great scene for indie comics right now.
And I don't want to seem like I'm overselling IndieGoGo, but one of the things you're doing here, Ryan, is trying to get word out for independent creators and things like that, like ourselves. And one of the things is that IndieGoGo has everybody that backs the book is assigned a number. So, you have like the first person is number 1, second person 2, all the way up to 1,100, which is what we have now. So everybody gets assigned a number. So it's not like Kickstarter. Kickstarter, if you have a problem or when you're trying to fulfill, there's no rhyme or reason how to find names. You just have to scroll all the names to find that person. They're not even in alphabetical order or by tier. So when you're trying to troubleshoot or you're trying to fulfill your campaign, IndieGoGo has numbers. So you're always, like, if somebody has a problem and they say they're number 5, you're always going to know where they were in the campaign. And if somebody says, I'm number 800, then you're going to know that they were later in the campaign. So it just makes it easier. And also the number
it has the name of the person and also has their tier that they backed. So with that number, it's assigned a name and their tier. So that information is readily accessible just by the number, which isn't, at least at this point, I haven't done a Kickstarter in a year or so. At least as far as I understand, Kickstarter doesn't have that feature.
Does it have their address? Because I know there's like one guy that, I did the survey, and then he never gave me his address, or I don't have his email, and he never got back to me, so I could never send it out to him.
Yeah, with IndieGoGo, it's all there. Because the thing with IndieGoGo as well, as soon as they buy the book, their credit card information goes through. It gets processed. So there's no, like, how Kickstarter at the end, they have to go and try to get funds.
Yeah.
You have to make sure that everybody pays and all that other stuff. And as well as I do, not everybody, at the end of the campaign comes through with their pledges. And that breaks your heart, because sometimes it can be $800, $1,000. That's a big deal. But with IndieGoGo, their information, their credit card, it goes through at that moment in time. They don't come back later and say, try to collect the money. The money's already collected.
As a buyer, it's so much more convenient to have those funds taken initially than, because I've bought stuff on Kickstarter, and it's always weird if several months pass and then you see it kind of gives way to you sometimes getting refunds and stuff if they wait too long on Kickstarter, because you often don't know maybe what those charges are from.
Yeah, and so people sometimes forget, or they say, well, I don't want that book anymore or whatever, so they don't come through with their pledges at the end. We're talking about Kickstarter at this point, but IndieGoGo isn't like that. Once their credit card, once they bought the book, the credit card information goes through. So pretty much, you can still refund, but they have to contact you, and you kind of have to refund it personally, which we do. If people decide for whatever reason there's a problem. But I'll tell you right now, there have been far less refunds. Far less refunds with IndieGoGo and this campaign than we ever had with Kickstarter.
Yeah, I'm going to have to check that out. So you guys also have a YouTube channel too, right? I was just watching last night. I was watching your Star Wars commentary for the new Episode 9 trailer. That's pretty cool. Yeah,
I went a little off on trying to predict what direction Star Wars franchise was going to go. So that'll give you a little glimpse of kind of what I did with Greg Capullo and Walter Simonson. My imagination just goes crazy, and I think of all these ways that these stories can go. So yeah, it gets a little self-indulgent, but I thought it was fun. I think people had a lot of fun.
Cool.
It's the beauty of the channel, and the channel is ART THIBERT on YouTube.
Okay, yeah, I'll put links in the description below for all this, and for the IndieGoGo, and for your social media. You're on what, like
for Black and White?
Facebook? Well, for you, I'll put it in the description below. The links.
Cool. Well, thank you for doing that. Yeah. And yeah, with as far as the YouTube stuff, yeah, Taylor and I just hang out at Hack Shack Studios here, and we work on the book, and we draw and write and things live on YouTube. So if you guys want to see a book being brought together live, you can check us out on YouTube. So Black and White is pretty much manifesting in real time in front of your very eyes. So we have a lot of fun, and you can actually see us fail epically, live. What do they call that? Without a net?
Yeah, definitely. But it brings us close to our backers, because they're really a part of this book, not just with funding, but kind of getting a live behind the scenes view every week.
That's awesome. Okay, so check out Art and Taylor's IndieGoGo and the YouTube channel, and we'll wrap this up. Thanks, Art and Taylor, for being on.
Well, thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
Cool.